And when the wars were over, no one ever knew what they were about.
Well, if I said I was madly in love with you, you'd know I was lying.
Land is the only thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for, because it's the only thing that lasts.
If you've grown up in or around fundamentalism, you have probably noticed this dynamic where fundamentalism, nostalgia, sexism, and racism tends to travel together pretty often. Maybe you've seen it through contact with organizations like Vision Forum, with their historically inspired and highly gendered toy catalog, or their obsession with historical cosplay, or their efforts to reconstitute the reputations of Confederate generals, politicians, and theologians that everyone else was trying to forget. Or maybe as a child, you saw it more directly with older relatives who would make awkward comments about interracial marriage and dating. Or maybe you're seeing it today with the fight against DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nothing we've talked about so far really explains this part of the fundamentalist world. Up to this point, we have taken fundamentalism basically on its own terms, as a movement about Christian doctrine. But that's going to change today, because today we are taking our sketchy looking VW van, heading to the scenic but sinister world of Scarlett O'Hara, R.L. Dabney, and the Southern Confederacy. Today we'll talk about how Lost Cause mythology became Lost Cause theology.
Trouble sometimes are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear, now is at stake. Pumping your heart to God, says from the chastening rod. Seek the way pilgrims trod, Christians away. Jesus is coming soon, morning or night or noon.
Hi, friends, and welcome to another episode of These Troubled Times, a road trip through Christian fundamentalism. I'm your host, Rachel Darnall, trained theologian, amateur historian, quiverful baby, and defector from the culture wars. I come from a family that has a very distinctive look. When people see me with any one of my 9 siblings, they will immediately know that we're related. My husband, on the other hand, comes from a family where family resemblance is a little bit harder to detect. So when his siblings come to visit us, people will be just as likely to think that they are from my family of origin as his. Genetics are kind of weird that way. But once in a while, the resemblance will pop out when you least expect it, maybe in a facial expression or a certain mannerism, and you see it and you realize, okay, these people really do come from the same parents. That's kind of how Romanticism works in the fundamentalist modernist debate. As we've already seen in previous episodes, Romanticism was certainly a major influence on theological liberalism and later theological modernism. But it was also a major influence on fundamentalism, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Up to this point, we've really only looked at German Romanticism. But Romanticism wasn't just a German phenomenon. There was also a very vibrant Romantic scene in Scotland and later in England. British Romanticism gave the world some of its best English language literature, and one of the primary international markets for that literature was America. To Americans, the Romanticism that came out of England and Scotland was much more familiar, and it felt safer than the Romanticism that was coming out of Germany and other European nations. And obviously, it helped that this literature was in English. But the way that Americans responded to any given British Romantic author depended very much on whether they were above or below the Mason-Dixon line.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What? What? Ask for more?
In the North, the novels of Charles Dickens were extremely popular. Charles Dickens showed his middle and upper class readers a side of the world that they didn't often see, or at least they didn't pay attention to if they did see it. He exposed them to places like debtor's prison, the workhouse, budget boarding schools, and dangerous factory life. And he asked them to sympathize with people who they would have considered to be their social inferiors. This message resonated pretty easily in the North, which was already moving in a more egalitarian direction because it was much more industrial than the South, and there were many more opportunities for upward mobility. The South, however, had a distinct dislike for Charles Dickens. If you read reviews of Dickens' books in newspapers from the antebellum South, You will see this pattern of exaggerated bewilderment about Charles Dickens' popularity in the North. However, imperfectly and incompletely, Charles Dickens was disrupting traditional class hierarchies by inviting readers to consider how those hierarchies might be experienced by the people on the bottom end of them. For Southern plantation owners whose entire lifestyle was predicated on a very extreme form of class hierarchy, i.e., chattel slavery, this was a bridge too far. But for all the reasons that Southerners hated Charles Dickens, they loved another British Romantic writer named Sir Walter Scott.
Have we no better than this?
We have, my lord. His name is Ivanhoe.
If you close your eyes and think about the word medieval, chances are that whatever pictures are coming into your head have their origin in something written by Sir Walter Scott. Walter Scott wrote classics like Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, and the epic poem The Lady of the Lake. His books tended to either be set in medieval England or Scotland, or be nostalgic for that world. He was a huge commercial success, and he basically invented the concept of the historical novel. Along the way, he inspired a mania for all things medieval in his home country of Scotland, in England, and in America, and especially in the American South.
Then comes Sir Walter Scott with his enchantments, and by his single might sets the world in love with dreams and phantoms. Sir Walter had so large a hand in making Southern character as it existed before the war that he is in great measure responsible for the war. Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi.
I think everyone wants to believe that they are basically a good person. People in the antebellum South were no different. But by the 1830s, most of the world agreed that owning another person as a piece of human property was not something that a basically good person does. Now, this could have been a moment for some serious soul-searching on the part of Southerners, but why get introspective when instead you can dress up as Sir Lancelot and knock your cousin off a horse?
Tis the kingdom of Eliphaz, my naive friend.
I don't know if the South actually invented LARPing, but they certainly perfected the art. Long before history nerds were getting together to perform reenactments of Civil War battles, the Southern elite used to enjoy putting on these elaborate jousting tournaments. Medieval reenactment was a whole thing in the antebellum South. There were elaborate sets, there was real jousting. Southern women would dress up in full medieval costume, hoping to be picked as the tournament's queen of love and beauty. This was basically a bougie version of the Renaissance Festival. Now, I myself am no stranger to Renaissance festivals, sci-fi conventions, and period costumes. So I promise that I really can sympathize with the appeal of LARPing. But as dearly as I would love to say that the South's obsession with medieval cosplay was just all good, clean fun, medieval LARPing served a very specific psychological purpose. Southerners needed to defend their reputation from outside criticism and their own sense of moral integrity in the face of increased scrutiny directed at the South's peculiar institution, which was a euphemism for chattel slavery. The South's answer to this dilemma was Southern Romanticism, a highly specific appropriation of certain aspects of British Romanticism. Even though it's not historically accurate in a conventional sense, the movie Gone with the Wind captures the imaginary world that the Southern plantation class inhabited before the Civil War.
Flower of the South assembles at the Junior League Ball, social highlight of the festivities. Glamorous Vivian Lee takes a bow as heroine Scarlett O'Hara and wins Atlanta's hour. Grand March. Governors of neighboring states and notables from all the nations see Atlanta's elite and Hollywood's elect revive the grace and gallantry of the Old South. Atlanta's few remaining boys in gray are guests of honor.
Gone with the Wind was really the twilight of the 1930s. Premiering in 1939, it was based off of a 1936 novel by Margaret Mitchell. The novel had already been a huge commercial success, so there was a lot of anticipation built up around the release of the movie. Virtually everyone in America went to see this movie, and a lot of people saw it more than once. The plot of Gone with the Wind is not actually very important to this episode, but just to give you a really quick synopsis, Scarlett O'Hara is a 16-year-old Southern belle on the eve of the Civil War. She's only interested in going to parties, flirting, and making all the men, but especially Ashley Wilkes, fall in love with her. Despite Scarlett's best efforts, Ashley Wilkes ends up marrying his cousin Melanie and then goes off to fight in the Confederate Army. Scarlett and Melanie are kind of thrown together when Ashley Wilkes leaves, and Ashley makes Scarlett promise that she will take care of Melanie. When the Union Army arrives in Atlanta, Georgia, Scarlett and Melanie flee, and Scarlett becomes obsessed with saving the family plantation, Tara. But she still hasn't gotten over Ashley, and when he comes back from the war, she is just intent on stealing him away from Melanie. In the meanwhile, she is overlooking the only man who has ever understood her, Rhett Butler, the original handsome rake with a heart of gold. So you get the idea. This is trashy romance novel stuff. It's a guilty pleasure. It's basically the 1930s version of Bridgerton. But it's also cinematically gorgeous.
Gone with the Wind.
This movie spared no expense on costumes, on sets, on casting, and of course, that fabulous score. There's a reason why, 87 years later, we're still talking about this movie. Of course, there's another less flattering reason why we're still talking about this movie, and that is that it is racist as heck. And no matter what anyone tells you, the racism in Gone with the Wind is not a side plot. It's supposed to look like the side plot, but it is actually the entire point. So you might be saying, you can't read Margaret Mitchell's mind. How can you be so sure? I can be sure because Gone with the Wind didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the latest iteration of the Southern romantic drama. Gone with the Wind is eerily similar to a 1905 novel called The Klansman, which is basically Ku Klux Klan fanfiction, and was the source material for the infamous white supremacist propaganda film, The Birth of a Nation. You can really see how the escapism of the Southern romantic drama works in Gone with the Wind. Enslaved Black people will appear on screen, but when they do, it's almost always as part of the scenery or occasionally as comic relief. It's like the camera wants you to see them but not quite look them in the eye. On the other hand, it's hard to look away from the world of the O'Haras and the Wilkes because it's beautiful. Beautiful clothes, beautiful people, beautiful houses and grounds. The movie is showing you a world that is built on slavery, a world that would not be possible without slavery, but it keeps trying to convince you the story isn't slavery. The story is Scarlett O'Hara and whether she's going to end up with Ashley Wilkes or Rhett Butler. The story is Tara and 12 Oaks and Atlanta in Flames. But whatever it is, it's just not slavery.
I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there have not forgotten. Look away, look away.
Southern Romanticism was extremely effective at this job. A generation of Southern men and women who grew up on the novels of Sir Walter Scott and were trained to see themselves in his characters, internalized the idea that slavery was part of a grand old world that was morally superior to the fast-paced, commercialized world of the North. Among the Southerners who inherited this view was a guy named Robert Louis Dabney.
Our best hope is in the fact that the cause of our defense is the cause of God's Word and of its supreme authority over the human conscience. That Word is on our side. R.L. Dabney, A Defense of Virginia.
By Southern Presbyterians, Dabney was seen as this larger-than-life mythic hero in the mold of reformers like John Knox or John Calvin. Without a doubt, Dabney was a product of Southern Romanticism. He was born in 1820, which means that he would have been coming of age at the time when Southern Romanticism was at its peak. He grew up on a small-scale plantation that probably would have looked a little bit like Tara. After graduating from seminary, Dabney returned home to help his widowed mother run the plantation, so he would have been up close and personal with slaves and the slave system. As an adult, he acquired slaves of his own. He never gave up his firm belief that Southern slavery was a positive moral good that benefited everybody involved. Even if Dabney didn't read Scott's novels himself, which is improbable, the world that he lived in was shaped by this imaginary version of medieval history, where the wealthy and powerful were for the most part noble, generous, and brave, and the poor working classes were for the most part grateful for their protection and guidance.
After a brief message, we'll be right back.
I want to give a special thanks to the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry for sponsoring a portion of today's episode. I've worked as a curriculum developer for the Anastasis Center since 2024. I've worked on a few projects, including an 8-part video series called It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 Effect. I personally have learned so much from their materials on retributive versus restorative justice, and I am absolutely thrilled to partner with Anastasis in a different way as a sponsor for these troubled times.
And now, back to the show.
But my purpose in the following pages is, first and chiefly, to lay this pious and filial defense upon the tomb of my murdered mother, Virginia. The last and only office that remains to her sons is to leave their testimony for her righteous fame. Feeble it may be now, amidst the din of passion and material power, yet inextinguishable as truth's own torch. R. L. Dabney.
Romanticism prompted nationalist movements wherever it went because it raised awareness about cultural history, language, and artistic accomplishments. The American South was no exception to this rule. Secession would have been a non-starter if it weren't for the fact that between the 1820s and the 1850s, the Romantic novels of Sir Walter Scott stirred up the sense of localized national identity in the South, which aspiring Confederates could draw upon as they recruited other Southerners to their cause. People will sometimes visit the South and say that certain parts of it, at least, feel like a different country. This is the residual effect of Southern Romantic nationalism, and is part of the reason why the Lost Cause mythology has had such a staying power.
Just a moment, please.
But is your wedding ring, ma'am?
It may help my husband more. Off my finger.
I freely declare that under God, my chief hope for my prostrate country is in their women. R. L. Dabney, 1866.
Southern men had faced defeat on the battlefield, but now it was up to Southern women to fight the battle on a different front, the home. As long as Southern mothers raised sons and daughters who were loyal to the cause, defeat was only temporary. Southern women answered that call. Between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, women's clubs popped up all over the South, dedicated to providing financial aid to the widows and orphans of Confederate soldiers who had died in action, but most of all, to telling the story of the Civil War through the lens of Southern Romanticism. These groups were consolidated in the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894, an organization which, by the way, is still active. In an article in FacingSouth.org, Greg Huffman says, "Perhaps nothing illuminates the UDC's true nature more than its relationship to the Ku Klux Klan. Many commentators have said the UDC simply supported the Klan. That is not true. The UDC, during Jim Crow, venerated the Klan and elevated it to a nearly mythical status. It dealt in and preserved Klan artifacts and symbology. It even served as a sort of public relations agency for the terrorist group. This was complementary gender roles Neo-Confederate edition. Neo-Confederate men joined the KKK, and Neo-Confederate women followed behind them, burnishing their image and cleaning up their public relations messes."
More than half a century had passed since the bloodshed and sordid horrors of Culloden. The story began to take on a warm, attractive glow as a Highland romantic epic of heroism and villainy, of intrigue and bravery. The result was a burgeoning neo-Jacobitism, the original romantic lost cause. Arthur Herman.
Southern Romantics had a taste for high drama and tragedy that they had inherited from Scottish Romanticism. Sir Walter Scott's novels were set in a Scotland that never really quite existed. Walter Scott was genuinely interested in real historical preservation, but he was also a novelist, and his main priority was to tell a good story. As we'll remember from previous episodes, the Protestant Reformation, and especially John Knox's Protestant resistance theory, had proved to be very disruptive. It had caused a Protestant revolution in Scotland, and eventually it would cause a series of religiously motivated civil wars in England. Those civil wars concluded, more or less, with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when English Puritans succeeded in deposing James II and handpicking his replacement. Jacobites were British subjects, and especially Scottish subjects, who were loyal to James II and his family line. The Jacobites did not see themselves as rebels, even though the rest of the empire did, because they considered the current monarchy to be the rebels, the usurpers, and they were just trying to put things back the way they were supposed to be. By the time that Walter Scott was born in 1771, the Jacobite cause had been dead for almost 30 years. It never came back as a true political movement, but Scottish romantics were captured by the romantic appeal of the Jacobite cause. Sir Walter Scott made the Jacobite rebellion kind of a shorthand for the larger battle of the Old World against the forces of modernity.
How the young South, led by the reincarnated souls of the clansmen of old Scotland, went forth against overwhelming odds, daring exile, imprisonment, and a felon's death, and saved the life of a people, forms one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Aryan race. Thomas Dixon, Jr., Preface to the Clansman, 1904.
The 1715 Jacobite uprising was the backdrop for the novel Rob Roy, and the 1745 Jacobite uprising was the backdrop for the Waverley novels. And all of these books were wildly popular in the South. They named children and horses and plantations after people and places in these novels. So this was Star Wars or Lord of the Rings level cultural buy-in. In the same way that the medieval reenactments inspired by Ivanhoe had provided an escape from the unpleasant realities of the slave system that the Southern elite were benefiting from, the world of Edward Waverley and Rob Roy provided an escape from the moral reckoning that was overdue in the South. At this point, you're probably thinking, this is all fine and well, and maybe it explains some things about the world that we're looking at, but what does it have to do with first wave fundamentalism? After all, most of the contributors to the fundamentals were from the North. The Stewart brothers, the oil tycoons who had funded the fundamentals, were Pennsylvania natives, and Lyman Stewart had actually been an abolitionist. So you would think that first wave fundamentalism would be sympathetic to the cause of racial justice. But there is a part of the story that we still have to tell.
Historically speaking, when faced with the choice between racism and equality, the American church has tended to practice a complicit rather than a courageous Christianity. They chose comfort over constructive conflict and created and maintained a status quo of injustice. G. Mar Tisby, The Color of Compromise.
Remember back in the 2010s when John Piper and some other neo-reformed leaders decided that they wanted to spearhead a movement for racial reconciliation in the church. If you followed that movement at all, you will know that it came to an abrupt end in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, who came to office largely through the efforts of white evangelicals, with the result that today we are more racially divided than when this racial reconciliation project started. John Piper's sincere but naive efforts at racial reconciliation failed because he had not taken the time to adequately deconstruct the cheap reconciliation that had occurred after the Civil War, not between whites and blacks, but between white Northern Protestants and white Southern Protestants. The slavery issue was causing fractures in Protestant denominations even before the war started. Once legal emancipation had been achieved with the 13th Amendment, white Northern Protestants lost their motivation to see the fight for racial equality through to its conclusion. Instead, they focused on healing the fractured relationship between the North and the South. But the South had never repented of participating in slavery. And thanks to the Southern Romantic retelling of the Civil War, they felt like they were the injured party and that the North owed them an apology. As long as that was the case, reconciliation was not going to happen without some major compromises on the part of Northern churches. The unspoken agreement went something like this. Southern churches would come back into fellowship with Northern churches if the North would stop talking about race. And that was really all the South needed for the North to do in order for them to reassert dominance over the Black population in the South. Like I said, Lyman Stewart at one point was a vocal abolitionist, but by the time that the fundamentals were published, neither he nor his brother nor anybody else involved with the project saw a problem with the fact that the editor for the first 2 volumes had family ties to the Ku Klux Klan. A.C. Dixon was the brother of Thomas Dixon Jr., and Thomas Dixon Jr. was the author of that book that we talked about a little bit earlier, the 1905 novel The Klansman. A.C. and Thomas Jr. grew up in Shelby, North Carolina, in an overtly white supremacist family. Thomas Dixon Jr. dedicated The Klansman to his uncle, Leroy McCaffey, who he described as a Scotch-Irish leader of the South and Grand Titan of the Invisible Empire Ku Klux Klan. Now, just because A.C. Dixon had a white supremacist brother and an uncle who ran the local KKK doesn't mean that A.C. approved of those views. But the silence itself is what tells you that this dirty alliance between Northern fundamentalism and Southern racism was working. When A.C. Dixon started editing the fundamentals, his brother's book would have been out already for 4 or 5 years. The movie inspired by his brother's book, The Birth of a Nation, came out the same year that the last volumes of the fundamentals were published. White supremacy was a current issue as the fundamentals were being written, and the authors did not see fit to acknowledge that or push back against it. A.C. Dixon himself never spoke out against his brother or his uncle's white supremacist activities. By not addressing it, A.C. Dixon and his fellow fundamentalists communicated, at the very least, that racial equality was not important enough to be worth offending Southern Christians over. Northern fundamentalism and Southern fundamentalism had slightly different origin points, but they did share a common enemy, and that enemy was modernism. Northern fundamentalists were primarily concerned with theological modernism, and they didn't tend to stray into the territory of cultural modernism. But Southern fundamentalists, who had been formed by Southern Romanticism and discipled by the works of R.L. Dabney, just hated any kind of progress at all. Dabney certainly wrote against liberal theology and the German school of higher criticism, but he also picked fights with feminists, socialists, and the scientific community, including and especially Charles Darwin. The influence of Robert Dabney helps to explain this shift that we see in fundamentalism between the 1910s and the 1920s. In between those 2 decades, fundamentalism morphed from an academic debate to a grassroots movement. And along the way, theological particulars tended to be abandoned in favor of cultural pressure points.
All I want is your honest opinion.
One thing I've learned over the last 6 years is never underestimate the narrative power of losing. Winning is all fine and well, but the high only lasts for so long. Resentment, paranoia, and nostalgia are just, unfortunately, longer burning fuel than a happy ending. From the get-go, Donald Trump used the appeal of a lost cause to attract followers. I've said before that losing the 2020 election is the best thing that ever happened to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. Winning would have just gotten him 4 more years in office. Losing gave him a founding myth, the lost cause of a beleaguered patriot trying to win a rigged election. An election victory is a headline, but a stolen election is lore. I will leave you with Ecclesiastes 7:10, which says, "Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." There is no gospel of Gone with the Wind in the Bible. Just brutal honesty about the way that sin corrupts both human individuals and human systems. and an invitation to partner with Jesus to resist sin and its effects wherever we find ourselves on the timeline. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed putting it together. When we pick up in July, we will talk about Romanticism again, this time in the highly emotional revivalist tradition. And we'll talk about how revivalism spawned the concept of the celebrity pastor. I hope to see you there. Until then, go in peace and stay groovy.
Trouble sometimes.